The viewpoints expressed on Night Fright are not necessarily those of the host, the staff, the sponsors, or the affiliate stations. Tonight's program may contain graphic themes or images. Viewer discretion is advised.
There is a time for question. There is a time for answers. There is a time to challenge. There is a time to speculate. There is a time for change. There is a time for truth. The time is now. Welcome to Night Fright, your voice in the dark for harmony and conspiracy. And now your host, Brent Holland.
Showtime! Welcome to the show. I'm Brent Holland, and welcome one and all to Night Fright. Tonight, folks, get in your most comfy chair, kick your feet up, relax. We've got a heck of a show for you tonight. We're going to be looking at the Bilderberg group. First of all, I want to encourage you to get the coffee going, get the tea going, or get a beverage of your choice going. Richard Syrett is here tonight to tell us about his latest exclusive engagement, which includes the Canadian theatrical premiere of Bilderberg, the movie. Let me pronounce that again. Bilderberg, the movie. And this is a movie made by Nobel Prize and Pulitzer Prize nominee Daniel Estulin. Many folks will recognize the name of Daniel Estulin and his groundbreaking book called The True Story of the Bilderberg Group. Now, after the film, Estulin will deliver a 90-minute presentation followed by a Q&A. Now, he's going to be exhausted, but he's there for you, folks. Now, immediately following that, there will be a 1-hour meet and greet and a book signing. So you're going to get to meet not only Richard in person, and he'll be there to answer all kinds of questions for you. And let's face it, he is a celebrity. And look at that face. Isn't he good looking? He's got the perfect face, folks, for television, whereas I have the perfect body and face for radio. The conference takes place on Sunday, April 17th, 2016, April 17th, 2016. The doors are going to open around 3:30. Now, from 4 to 7, that's when the movie's going to be happening, and the presentation question and answer period is going to be between 7 and 8 p.m. with the meet and greet right after. It's going to be taking place at the J.J.R. McLeod Auditorium, the University of Toronto, 1 King's College Circle, Toronto, Ontario. And of course, I'm going to put all that information up on the www.nightfrightshow.com website. So that'll be a focal point for you. Richard Syrett, of course, is host of Toronto's well-known TV and radio show, The Conspiracy Show. Also, he's a co-host to Coast to Coast. Now, tonight, Richard and I are going to discuss something of the background of the Bilderberg Group and why this conference is a must-attend event. This show tonight couldn't happen, folks, at a more appropriate time, as the Panama Papers have just broke. They've been leaked to the press, and we're going to explain why this is important, not only to the world as a whole, but to the 99% of us that don't have offshore accounts and are hiding trillions and trillions of dollars. But we're going to start with the Bilderbergs first. Now, let me tell you this interesting fact. Switzerland's Credit Suisse estimates the entire wealth of the world to be $444 trillion. Now, of that $444 trillion, I don't even know how big a room would you need for $444 trillion? I have no idea. That's why they need the offshore accounts, obviously. Of that, the Rothschilds are said to have $300 trillion, and the Rockefellers $100 trillion. So essentially, what this means, folks, is 2 families only control the vast amount of the world's wealth. And with the rest of us, where does that put us? when we're working hard every day to put food on the table for our kids and shoes on their feet. Is there a problem? I think so. Now, bear in mind, in addition to these outrageous numbers, 1% of the world's population controls 46% of all world assets. So again, where exactly does that place the rest of us on the scale of rich and poor? It's my great pleasure to welcome back to Night Fright my friend Richard Syrett, all the way from Toronto, where he's being a super trooper and staying up late. Can you tell us what prompted this great conference you set up for us, Richard?
Well, thank you very much, Brent. And let me just remind folks, if they're interested in attending, they want to go to my website, strangeplanet.ca, and click on the live events page. They can order their tickets right there, and there are some other ways they can get tickets. We can mention that later. But why now? Well, first of all, it's important to mention again Daniel Estulin, who is my featured guest. And Daniel has just completed a new documentary film called Bilderberg the Movie, as you mentioned. And this, I can't even begin to describe sort of the incredible journey that Daniel went on in trying to make this film. Never mind the 20 years of research that went into it, but when it actually came time to make it, the subterfuge that was at work here, a number of occasions the movie was basically shelved. Partners suddenly went bankrupt. Banks were calling in their note for some inexplicable reason. It was if someone behind the scenes was trying to make damn sure this movie wasn't made. Finally, he found out that his partner had been bought out by a consortium owned by Halliburton and the Bush family. So his partners were now essentially Dick Cheney and George Bush. So at that point, it was obvious to him what was going on. So he decided to start making the movie over again. At this point, he'd already shot hundreds of hours of film around the world. So he basically said, "Well, I don't own this footage, so I'm gonna go out and start over again." And he did, and people can see the results on Sunday, April the 17th. Daniel will be there live. I'm flying him in from Spain. He'll present the film, do then on top of that a 90-minute presentation, then a Q&A and a book signing. So first and foremost, because the movie's out. Secondly, and most importantly perhaps, is people are ready for this information. They know there's something going on, and it's all about timing. And people are really champing at the bit to know how the world really operates, not what the New York Times says or how CNN and Anderson Cooper tells you it operates, but what's going on behind the curtain.
For real. Let me tell you, folks, a few of the names from the Canadian side of things, a few of the politicians that we've had that have attended Bilderberg Group meetings. They range from Ralph Klein, Paul Martin, who was a prime minister, Preston Manning, who also ran to be prime minister, Jean Chrétien, who was prime minister, and Stephen Harper, of course, who was prime minister. Now, what is discerning to me is the fact that in a democracy, one of the safeguards to make elected officials accountable to the populace that elected them is something called the free press, where the press has the right to question each individual who we've elected to Parliament, in our case, each individual that we've elected to power. It's the only way they stay accountable to us. What happens when they go behind closed doors, folks, is anybody's guess, because the press are not allowed to cover this whatsoever. As a matter of fact, all these people are sworn to secrecy, so we have no idea. I mean, they could just be playing cards, who knows, or more than likely, if they won't allow the press in, something else far, far more ominous, in my opinion, is taking place. Your thoughts on that, Richard?
Well, you're precisely right. First of all, I think it's important to note that there's nothing illegal necessarily about very wealthy, very powerful, influential people, including politicians, to gather behind closed doors. They do it all the time for what they call in-camera sessions, no press allowed, and this is so that they can speak frankly, off the cuff, off the record. and without the scrutiny of television lights and so forth. And this happens at G8 meetings, at G20 meetings. Here's where it gets kind of sinister in my books, and that is that it's not just industrialists and bankers and heads of state and kings and queens of Europe that are in attendance. Investigative or media people, including news anchors, are also in attendance. I have it on good authority that Peter Mansbridge of CBC has been invited and has attended. People like Rupert Murdoch, so media magnets. So when you have journalists in attendance, the late Peter Jennings attended the Bilderberg meeting. Heather Reisman, the owner of Indigo, who is obviously a gatekeeper. She decides what books get in and what books are not available to her bookstore. She is.
Sorry to interrupt. I just want to tell folks who Heather Reisman is. Heather Reisman owns a huge bookstore franchise here in Canada called Chapters Indigo. It would be the equivalent of Barnes & Noble in the States. So imagine Barnes & Noble telling you what can and what cannot be sold in their bookstore. And this is exactly what Heather's done. Sorry to interrupt you, Richard.
No, you're absolutely right, because Daniel Estulin's book, The True Story of the Bilderberg Group, this is not some rinky-dink little publication that he hammered out in his parents' basement. This is a major worldwide bestseller. It has sold in excess of 5 million copies, has been translated into 41 languages around the world. And yet, if you go to Chapters Indigo, you will not find that book on their bookshelves. And it might be interesting, kind of an experiment for someone to go up to the desk and order it, or try to order it. Now, why do you suppose they wouldn't have that book that has sold 5 million copies around the world in a bookstore where the owner is the regular attendee of the Bilderberg conference?
Yeah, it's outrageous.
It is outrageous. So that's the scary part, is that not only do you have journalists who are attending and saying nothing, and then denying that they go in many cases, but then you have the owners of these mainstream media outlets using their publications and their airwaves to promote a particular agenda, whatever is decided upon in the Bilderberg meeting. And thankfully, again, due to people like Daniel Estulin and also the late Jim Tucker, Alex Jones, a lot of the agendas now are being leaked during the actual conferences. And remember, up until, let's say, 10 years ago, everyone denied that there was a Bilderberg group. Well, they were forced to admit now that they exist. In fact, they have their own website. They thought, okay, well, let's hide in plain sight. So they have a website, and they say, yes, we're here. We do meet once a year. But really, there's nothing sinister, folks. We're just trying to, discuss world events and help the world. Well, if that's the case, then you would think that they would want the media to get on board and they would be promoting their agendas, but they're not. It's all very hush-hush, and that's what's most disturbing.
Now, a little background about the Bilderberg Group, folks. They were discovered, or established, I should say. They were discovered long after this. They were established in 1954. Now, annually, they get between 100 and close to 200 people, mostly of European and North American political elite, experts from the industry, finance, academia, and the media. Now, the quote is, they were put together to bolster a consensus around free market Western capitalism and its interests around the globe. So that's pretty open to interpretation. Now, their theme is that bolstering free market Western capitalism and its interests around the globe. Now, what is terrifying about that, again, is exactly what are the interests of Western capitalism? Well, capitalism, its bottom line is to make a buck. And I wrote an MBA, and the people are just left out of the equation. You are taught, if you can save $20 by getting rid of 200 or 300 people working, you do it. Because the idea is to make the company as strong and as profitable as possible. And the heck with the people, they are just there to make money for the company. And this is terrifying to me because it leaves out the whole human race as part of that equation. So in other words, we're working for who? We're not working for us. We're not working for the betterment of us or the betterment of our own country. We are working purely for the profitability of a company. Richard?
Well, you're exactly right. One of the objectives of groups like the Bilderberg groups, the Council on Foreign Relations, and it is surmised that the Bilderberg groups, and we're talking again about people like David Rockefeller, who is 100 years old, over 100 years old, still attends, one of the permanent members, and they have sort of a permanent steering committee, sort of an inner group, people like Kissinger and Rockefeller, and then they have their invitees, Christine Lagarde, the president of the IMF, for example, Bill Gates, and one of the things that they're trying to do, a lot of these organizations, is all about globalization. It's the destruction of the nation state, because there's nothing that impedes the free flow of capital like national borders, where you have individual jurisdictions, each with its own set of regulations. That is an enigma to the free flow of capital. So if they can get rid of that, and that's when we get into globalization and free trade and forming these huge trading partners and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the North American Free Trade Organization. These are all about eroding national sovereignty. And that's one of the objectives, because it's not necessarily about one world government, it's about one world corporation. You alluded to concentration of ownership, and we're not talking about one percenters here. I mean, here in Canada, the one percenters are people that make over maybe $250,000 a year. But we're talking about, 1/1000th of the one percenters. We're talking about people who have more money than God. We're talking about wealth that has been accumulated over centuries by certain families. And again, nothing wrong with that, but how do they wield that power, that influence? Well, what would you do if you were a trillionaire and you saw 7 billion people out there that wanted to consume the oil and eat the food? Well, and they're becoming more educated because of the internet and so forth. You'd be very panicky. You'd want to control them. You'd want to reduce their number. So depopulation is certainly part of it. And again, the destruction of the nation state. Those are the two primary objectives. They want to take us back to an era of feudalism, whether before the Treaty of Westphalia, no nations, no countries, just kings, queens, lords and vassals, and the peasants.
Guess what side of the fence I'd fall on?
You and me both, brother. It's a return to the Dark Ages. That's where we're heading. And
it's pretty terrifying.
It's the destruction of technology, too. The internet is no friend of these individuals.
You had mentioned the Trilateral Commission, and I just want to tell folks exactly what that is. Now, the Trilateral Commission's it's a non-government, non-partisan, supposedly, discussion group founded by David Rockefeller. Now, that was in July 1973. Now, the idea behind it was to foster cooperation among North America, Western Europe, and Japan. It has since expanded in scope to include places like Australia, New Zealand, Malaysia, etc., etc. So there's a quote here, and this is a pretty stunning quote. David Rockefeller's newest international cabal, the Trilateral Commission, is intended to be the vehicle for multinational consolidation of the commercial and banking interests by seizing control of the political government of the United States. The Trilateral Commission represents a skillful, coordinated effort to seize control and consolidate the 4 centers of power. They are political, number 2, monetary, number 3, intellectual, and number 4, ecclesiastical. All this is to be done in the interest of creating a more peaceful, more productive world community. What the trilateralists truly intend is the creation of a worldwide economic power superior to the political governments of the nation states involved. They believe the abundant materialism they propose to create will overwhelm existing differences. As managers and creators of the system, they will rule the future. Now, somebody may say that is a very alarming and outrageous quote that I've just read. Well, it comes from no less a person than Senator Barry Goldwater, and that's from his book With No Apologies that was written in 1979, not that long ago. So that truly is revealing and very ominous where we're headed. So I think you're doing the world a service, Richard, by showing this. Have you come up against any opposition? Has anybody reached out and said, no, 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 we're not going to allow you to show this? Or have you run into anything of that sort? Well,
in my experience in nearly 25 years in this arena, it doesn't work that way. What happens is you're just ignored. You're ostracized. You're relegated to late night radio on the weekends where you really can't do any damage. And so there's a wonderful example when the Department of Homeland Security hired as a consultant a General Igor Primakov, who was a former KGB officer after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And Primakov came over to consult with Homeland Security and was absolutely impressed with the way that opposition is silenced here in North America, specifically the United States. And he said, in the USSR and the former Soviet Union, we had gulags. Here, you simply discredit people through the mainstream media, and it's far more effective. So that's very telling. So that's the way it works here. It's people roll their eyes, they chortle, they smile, and then they back out of the room slowly. So they ignore you, or your colleagues will call you a conspiracy theorist, and that's fine. They don't realize, though, that they've lost the room, that more and more people are waking up. They don't trust mainstream media for their information anymore. Ask young people a few years ago where they were getting their news from, and it was from Jon Stewart on The Daily Show. It's not right. From... we were talking about the complicity of the mainstream media and their silence. If I could share a quote with you very quickly here. This is from David Rockefeller, again, one of the permanent members of Bilderberg, of course, the patriarch of the Rockefeller family, now 100 years old. And he said, and I quote, "We are grateful to the Washington Post, the New York Times, Time Magazine, and other great publications whose directors have attended our meetings and respected their promises of discretion for almost 40 years. It would have been impossible for us to develop our plan for the world if we had been subjected to the lights of publicity during those years. But the world is more sophisticated and prepared to march towards a world government. Supranational sovereignty of an intellectual elite and world bankers is surely preferable to the national autodetermination practiced in past centuries." So he's thanking the media for their silence and helping them concoct their plan for one world government. David Rockefeller.
Unbelievable. Now, again, mainstream media has to be part of this equation because only 5 multinational companies control the vast majority of all media outlets: radio, print, movies, magazines, cable. The companies are, folks, Disney, News Corporation, Time Warner, Viacom, and Bertelsmann out of Germany. That's it. They cover all the media outlets, so they control the media completely. What gets funneled in gets funneled out. And I'll give you a prime example of that, the Kennedy assassination, and thank goodness for shows like Richard's, because he's had me on the show. Ted Sorensen confirmed conspiracy in the Kennedy assassination. I have tried and tried since he confirmed that 5 years ago to get mainstream media to cover it. I cannot get one source, not a single source, besides shows like Richard's and Coast to Coast, which Richard had me on, to cover that story. That's the problem in a nutshell with mainstream media. And he's exactly right, Richard. We are ostracized for trying to bring this truth forward. We are discredited left and right. We were passed over, etc., etc. Now, one of the accomplishments, Richard, that I have to give you a pat on the back for and the foresight that Vision TV has taken in airing your show. I was wondering if you could tell the folks a little bit about the conspiracy show on Vision TV here in Canada.
Thank you. Yes, we've just completed our 4th season and delivered that to our Canadian broadcaster, Vision TV, and it absolutely, Moses Neimer, I give great credit to him, visionary, to be sure. I mean, he is a pioneer in the industry. I think right up there in many ways with Marshall McLuhan, great media scientist. And thank God for Zoomer Media. They also, of course, carry my weekly radio show on Zoomer Radio. For the TV show, 4th season across Canada. We don't have an air date yet, but it'll be coming soon, brand new episodes. And of course, we've been sold internationally around the world. We're on in Australia. We're on in parts of Europe, places like Poland, the Czech Republic, the Italian-speaking market in Italy, San Bernardino, Vatican City, of all places, parts of Switzerland.
So the Pope's a fan. Is that what you're trying to tell me?
I'd be very interested to speak to the Pope and get his take on our program.
No, he's not a Bilderberger, is he?
He is. It's an interesting note, though. I don't think a Pope has ever been invited to a Bilderberg meeting, but I'm sure someone from the Vatican Bank has been in attendance. The TV show is doing very well for us, so we're very pleased. Thank you.
Mazel tov, that's fantastic. Now, I'm just curious, I don't know this for sure, but are there any Nazi roots to the Bilderbergers?
Oh, absolutely, not surprisingly. The very first Bilderberg meeting took place in 1954 at the Bilderberg Hotel in Oosterbeek, Netherlands, and that's why it became known as the Bilderberg Group, because that was the very first meeting. And the meeting was called and hosted by Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, the father of Queen Beatrix, who was up until recently the Queen of the Netherlands, a very wealthy, powerful European family. And Prince Bernhard was, until 1934, I believe, a card-carrying member of the Nazi Party. He was a member of the mounted SS. Now, of course, Bernhard maintains that he was interested in equestrian pursuits, and that's why he joined the mounted unit. And really, as soon as he found out what the Nazi Party were all about, he left. Okay, maybe not. I'm not convinced, given the fact that...
But he must have been aware he wasn't joining the Boy Scouts.
Exactly. So researchers like people like the late Jim Tucker, who just passed within the last year or two, another prominent Bilderberg researcher, and Daniel Estulin, have sort of traced back the early raison d'etre of the Bilderbergs, and it was, by and large, to repatriate a lot of the Nazi plunder, gold, priceless pieces of art. We're talking about, probably hundreds of billions of dollars that were stolen as the Nazis pillaged their way across Europe, and how to get the money out of Europe. That was the question. Remember when the Germans were defeated, the German army was defeated, the German army surrendered, but the German chancellor, or the vice chancellor at that time, because Hitler was dead, supposedly, the vice chancellor, the Third Reich, never surrendered. This is a historical fact. The German army surrendered, but not the Third Reich. And so all of that plunder was taken out of Europe to places like South America. This is all well documented, Argentina and so forth. And this was done with the aid of people like John Foster Dulles and his brother Alan Dulles. Mm-hmm. They were very instrumental. And we know, of course, the legacy of Prescott Bush and his involvement in funding the Nazis early on, and was tried and convicted of trading under the Trading with the Enemies Act. And people have forgotten that. And I'm investigating currently whether or not this is true, but I have read that under the terms of Prescott Bush's sentencing, no member of the Bush family was ever to seek public office again. So if that's true, then George Bush 41 and George Bush 43, those presidencies should have been declared illegal. Anyway, so the Bilderbergs, after the war, this meeting was all about getting that money, that Nazi plunder, and bringing it back into Europe. And that money was used to basically to form the European Union, a Fourth Reich, if you will, minus the the brown shirts and the swastikas. But ask countries like Greece and Spain and Portugal and Italy how they feel living under the European Union. Not very democratic.
The JFK Assassination, the definitive book by Brent Holland. From inside the Oval Office to Daily Plaza, first-person witness accounts. Order yours right now. nightfrightshow.com.
Part of this whole equation that's just broken the newspapers, and this is from a consortium, if you will, of free press journalists, received this information about the Panama Papers, which are millions of papers and documents that show who has money in the Cayman Islands, offshore accounts, who doesn't have money, what is set up as a money laundering situation. Now, I'd like to try and go into that a little bit, and I want to read this quote that was from the Star. Affluent Canadians and corporations have some $200 billion in declared assets stashed away in tax havens, costing government as much as $8 billion a year in foregone revenue, and it's all legal. And that's the quote from the Star. So what happens, folks, is an offshore tax account, a tax haven, if you will, is basically a bank account that you throw your money into where the money isn't taxed right away by the government that you're living under. So in other words, if you're a Canadian and you have, say, $100,000 or $100 million, you throw it into this offshore bank account with XYZ Bank, and they store the money for you, and you don't have to pay income tax on that. So the income tax on that, if you were living in Canada, would be quite substantial, and that money would go to fund social services like education, services like Medicare, services like roads and structures and everything that we ask government to do for us. And this is the major problem. It's tax dollars that are lost to the countries where they're being made. Any comments on that?
Certainly. First of all, I think it's when we just ended this discussion on the Bilderbergs, and we're talking about people that have a combined wealth in the trillions of dollars. So now we're talking about these offshore accounts, and their billions, and it's really small potatoes. It's almost, to me, a bit of a distraction, and I'm very suspicious. I'd like to know more about who these who are the members of this coalition of media outlets, because who knows, maybe some of their paymasters are also attending Bilderberg meetings, and they're talking about people like the great soccer player Messi and Jackie Chan, the great martial artist, and they've been caught up in this web. It's almost like they're throwing out these names as it's like the great Wall Street fiasco in 2008, and they had to pick a scapegoat. So who did they trot out there? Bernie Madoff. Right? Now, obviously, he did horrible things, but none of the heads of Goldman Sachs, none of these people did the perp walk. None of these people went to prison for their corporate malfeasance during 2008 and so forth. So to me, this is a bit of a distraction, and it'll be interesting to see, who are some of the other names. We have 12 current and former political leaders. We have the Prime Minister of Iceland has just resigned.
Yep.
We have Prime Minister Cameron of the UK, whose late father, Ian Cameron, had apparently a shell company. And we should also point out, there's nothing illegal about having an offshore account.
I was going to say that, yeah.
What happens, though, in many of these instances is we have this money that being laundered, drug money being funneled into terrorist organizations. We need to be concerned about that, obviously. But there are many reasons. Some of them are legitimate why someone would have money in an overseas account. It is interesting, though, that we're seeing very few American names attached to this.
Yet.
Vladimir Putin, of course, is being implicated.
And there's a very rich cellist.
Yes.
I was just reading about. He's worth $800 million. Now, You see, folks, I picked up drumsticks. I should have picked up a cello. What can I tell you?
And here's the thing: in the world of espionage and so forth, intelligence agencies have a lot of front companies, and they have slush funds and black op budgets and so forth, and these are hidden from public view. So my thinking is that a lot of this Panama Papers scandal is really kind of about spycraft. It's unseen war that goes on backstage between nations. We don't fight wars in the traditional ways that we used to with trench warfares and tanks. Now one group will raid another group's stock market, or they'll cause a derivative bubble to burst, or they'll cause a leak. They'll use someone like an Assange or a Snowden. Even within a country, one alphabet intelligence group will go after another and try to expose them. So there's this constant warfare going backstage, and occasionally it spills out onto the main stage. But this is not necessarily what it appears, in my thinking. This isn't simply about, corrupt politicians. Oh, there's a news flash. You mean, there are world leaders that have secret slush funds? And what do you think the Clinton Foundation is all about? This is just the way the world works. And occasionally, we get a glimpse of it. But this leads credence to the idea that, there is this corruption in high places. We shall see exactly, in the coming months, perhaps. I think May is when more details are said to be forthcoming. Huffington Post had a great description, sort of simplifying what the Panama Papers scandal was all about. And imagine, you have a piggy bank at home, and every week you put a quarter in there, and you put the piggy bank on your shelf in your bedroom, and your mom or dad comes in, and they check your piggy bank every week to make sure the money's going in there. Well, then suddenly you get wise to that. You say, well, I think I'll buy another piggy bank and take that over to my friend Jimmy's house, and he'll store it under his bed, and any money that I make extra outside of that 25 cents, I'll stick that in that piggy bank. Pretty soon, a lot of your friends and their friends are taking their piggy banks over to Jimmy, and Jimmy's got now 3 dozen piggy banks under his bed, and maybe he's charging them a little bit. But then one day, somebody, maybe Jimmy's parents, find the stash of piggy banks under his bed. And now all these people are found out. But the point is, some of those piggy banks, maybe in one of those piggy banks, someone stole lunch money from somebody and he squirreled it away. So that's a very, that's a bad thing, obviously. That's criminal. But in another instance, maybe someone was wanting to buy a birthday present for their sister, and they didn't want them to find out, so they had a piggy bank in a secret location so they could secretly, squirrel this money away. So they're going to have to sort out, who owned the good piggy banks and who owned the bad piggy banks, and what was the intent. But certainly there will be people sacrificed. I mean, a lot of these political leaders, they're essentially soap salesmen. They are there to be sacrificed at the whim of somebody higher up. And so if someone decides that, this person needs to take a fall, then they will. Why is Putin being implicated? Well, maybe he does have a bad piggy bank, or maybe he's done something to upset an opposing oligarch in Russia, and they're trying to depose him. And so they use these things. They use, again, the media to leak these things. This is not accidental. This isn't someone stumbling upon something. This was done deliberately. And it's being used as a weapon for many reasons. Now, is money being laundered? Yes. Is money being funneled into terrorist organizations? Yes. Is drug money being laundered? Yes. Are banks aware of it? Yes. Is some money being funneled into the North Korea, a front company, money being funneled into a front company offshore, and that's being funneled into North Korea's nuclear program? This is something that we've discovered. So all of these things are going on, but there's far more to it, and hopefully we'll find out more in the next month.
Yeah, I think that analogy that you just mentioned about the piggybacks is perfect. That's great. Now, a good friend of mine mentioned today too. He said, getting back to the smoke screen of all these names being released, if you can find a name that quickly, that fast, probably means they don't have money to hide. it's all the numbered accounts, because you don't have to go by your own name, folks, when you open up an account over at Jimmy's place. You can use 1, 2, 3, or you could use 5, 6, 7. It doesn't really matter. The thing is, once you're not using your name, it's very difficult to find out whose funds exactly those are. So in the case of, say, the CIA, if they wanted to throw several $1 million into a slush fund that they can go and operate out of and just grab the money whenever they need it, they could just call it 1, 2, 3. And who's going to know that that's associated with CIA? And that's part of the problem.
One of the points that has been made is, and I as well, is that there aren't a lot of Americans on the list so far, about 200. But there's actually a pretty good reason for that, and that is in the United States. I mean, you don't need to go to the Cayman Islands. You don't need to go to Panama, to Mossack Fonseca. You can register essentially an offshore account in states like Delaware and Nevada. I mean, the laws that permit that. So that may be one reason. If you're just doing it simply inside the United States, you're not going to Panama to open these offshore accounts. I just want to say one other thing, and more kind of a political. I don't have a problem with tax avoidance. Tax evasion is another matter, obviously. Tax avoidance, I'm all for it. I mean, the money that goes to to various levels of government, if it were going to repair the roads and the bridges and so forth, fine. But I don't see that happening. It's just going into this black hole. And to me, giving federal, provincial, municipal governments more and more tax revenues into giving a heroin addict, a bag of smack. They don't have a revenue problem. They have a spending problem. $32 billion a year in this country goes to interest to pay off debt, which they are now increasing by $30 billion a year under the boy king Justin Trudeau. That, to me, is far more scandalous and outrageous, and that is from our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. It'll never be paid off. That, to me, is as scandalous as anything that's coming out in the Panama Papers, and it's staring us right in the face.
Richard, in your opinion, is the system broken? Is capitalism broken?
Capitalism's not broken. The old saying, capitalism is the worst system on earth except for all the rest. Capitalism is a wonderful system. Capitalism, nothing comes close to creating wealth, and then that wealth being funneled into, charities and research. There's nothing that can come close. We don't have the problems that we're facing here are not problems with capitalism. There are problems with government nepotism, corporations that are in bed with the government, and that's the definition of fascism. When you have governments acting on behalf of certain corporations. Mm-hmm. The idea of being able to squirrel a little bit of money away, invest in the stock market, see a return, that's democracy, that's capitalism. We don't have free markets, though, the way we used to. We have gross manipulation of virtually every market, not only on the behalf or on the part of governments. They have now what they call these plunge protection systems, where they're actively engaged in manipulating the precious metal market, and it should be against the law, but it's not. They're allowed to do that. And we're seeing, there are certain corporations, obviously, that are and individuals that are behind this market manipulation. But capitalism, as it operates for the average person, is wonderful. It's wonderful. If we only had, if free markets were allowed to operate the way they're supposed to. The other important thing, though, is that free markets aren't designed, I don't believe, to work on a global scale. You have to have nation states. You have to have individual jurisdictions with their own rules and regulations. And this is one of the problems that we're facing now, is the erosion of the nation state. And I'll give you a perfect example. When Justin Trudeau was elected, of course, he attracted a lot of young people because he's young and he's charismatic. He's a very old-style politician, very old style. He's a throwback.
To his father and Chrétien.
Well, yes, very much so. He got a lot of votes when he went out there talking about we're going to legalize pot. Now, I'm not going to comment on whether we should legalize pot or not. That's another show. but he promised that knowing full well he couldn't deliver it. Why? Because Canada is entangled in a number of international agreements, 3 or 4 of them, which impact on narcotics, and one is with the United Nations. And these international agreements supersede Parliament. So if they were to pass a law decriminalizing possession of marijuana, it wouldn't stand because of these international agreements. And we're seeing this time and time again. There was under the North American Free Trade Organization, or North American Free Trade Pact, there was an additive that was added to gasoline up here in Canada and in the United States. And scientists were concerned that it was a carcinogen. And so our Parliament voted, and I believe it was under Mulroney, they voted to remove that additive from the gasoline. Well, the American corporation that was responsible for putting that additive in sued and won, and had that law not only struck down, but they forced Parliament to issue an apology, a public apology. So in other words, international agreements and entanglements prevent us from passing laws in our own country. I'll give you another example farther afield. In Greece, for example, or anywhere in Europe where they have lost control over their monetary system because they don't print their own currency. They have no fiscal policy because that's all determined by bureaucrats in places like Brussels. So if you don't control your own money, you really have no country. But it goes further than that under the EU. Under the bailout agreement in Greece, the Greek government had to cut back severely on pensions. So if you were a retired civil servant and you were making X number of euros, every month they were cutting it back severely in many cases. But not only did it affect public pension, there were people working in the private sectors, in banks, let's say, who took a retirement package. They are also seeing their pensions cut back, even though they and the bank paid into it, not the government. Well, they sued. They said, this is unconstitutional. The government can't do that. They took it to the Supreme Court, and they won. And yet the Greek government continues to cut private pensions, even though it's against the law. There is no rule of law. That's the problem with these supranational organizations like the European Union, Trans-Pacific Partnership, which will dwarf the European Union, North American Free Trade. We have all the trappings of a country. We have a flag. We have a prime minister. We have Mounties and our own postage stamps and the prime minister's on money. But it's a facade. These are the trappings of a nation state. When it comes down to it, we don't have sovereignty. We're losing it piecemeal, gradually. This is the threat.
I want to come back to where we started with the Bilderberg group, but let me just quote this from George Carlin, the very famous comedian. He says, they don't want well-informed, obedient workers. People who are just smart enough to run the machines and do the paperwork and just dumb enough to passively accept all these increasingly crappy jobs with lower pay, the longer hours, the reduced benefits, the end of overtime, and the vanishing pension that disappears the minute you go to collect it. George Carlin, folks, wise man. Let's go back to your conference that's coming up and talk a little bit about that, a little bit more about where people can go and things of that nature with the conference.
Yes, well, thank you. Sunday, April the 17th, I'm flying Daniel Estulin in to Toronto at the University of Toronto, the J.J.R. McLeod Auditorium. That's one King's College Circle right there in the heart of the beautiful St. George campus, University of Toronto. Sunday, April 17th. Doors open at 3:30. At 4 o'clock, Daniel will present the Canadian theatrical premiere of his new documentary, Bilderberg the Movie. He poured his own money into this. He'll tell you about the incredible journey it took to make this film. And I've seen it, and it's spectacular. It's an incredible document. It really must be seen. This is important. This is so important. Never mind Anderson Cooper 360. This is the news that you really need to know about. This affects you, your family, your grandchildren. And so from 4 o'clock, he'll present the film. After that, he'll give a 90-minute presentation, the culmination of 20 years of his research into the Bilderberg Group. After that, there'll be a Q&A session, then a book signing and a meet and greet. We'll finish off at 8 o'clock. Again, Sunday, April 17th. It's called Bilderbergs. And if people want to get tickets or more information, they can go to my website, strangeplanet.ca. Strange Planet, all one word, strangeplanet.ca. Go to the live events page and just click on the Bilderbergs, and you can order tickets right there online. Or my good friends Patrick and Kadena, who own Conspiracy Culture, which is a great bookstore in Toronto, 1344 Bloor Street West. If you go to Conspiracy Culture, you can buy them in store. They can order them over the phone, 416-916-1696, 416-916-1696, or they can order them from their live events page at conspiracyculture.com.
Is the fix in, Richard?
Is the fix in? Oh, it has always been thus. I mean, you believe in the Bible, I believe in the Bible. That's the ultimate conspiracy, right? We know who runs this world. It's Satan, right? He's in charge. Good news is, you know, if you read right to the very end of the week, we know who wins. It's the good guys. So this is...
Are we winning? Are we losing right now?
Are we losing right now? It would appear so. It's almost like we're in this David versus Goliath struggle, but David doesn't have a slingshot. And I always like to say, you know, they have trillions of dollars at their disposal. They have all of their resources. They have standing armies. They've got everything going their way. We only have the truth. They don't stand a chance.
It's a perfect way to end it. Folks, Richard Syrett's been our guest tonight. You can catch his show every week, The Conspiracy Show, on the radio, and you can also catch it on television. And Richard, all the best to you and your family. Thanks so much for being a super trooper tonight with all the technical issues that we faced in the first hour.
I would walk through the gates of hell for you, Brent. You're a good friend. Thank you.
Thank you, my friend. All the very best to you.
Bye.
I'm Brent Holland from Night Fright. Thank you all for joining us. See you next time.
You're listening to Night Fright and your host, Brent Holland. The time is now. Your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy.
The JFK Assassination, the definitive book by Brent Holland. From inside the Oval Office to Daily Plaza, first-person witness accounts. Order yours right now, nightfrightshow.com.